Welcome to ESGX Live, the community for education and information to inspire collaboration and action on all things to do with sustainability. And we are here today, or at least I am here today in Scotland. I was in Glasgow a little bit earlier on, and this is a picture from today, not one from the internet. And just to start, as we work into our halftime report for what has been happening at COP26, I thought I'd just give you a brief reflection on the kind of essence of what it feels like to be in Glasgow. And that is a lot of people just going about their everyday lives in a very normal manner. Clearly, there's the conference centre walled off from the outside world with a lot of railings and some cheerful policemen wandering around. There's a few protesters singing protest songs. There was a climate ceilidh outside one of the entrances. There was a half-deflated cow in one of the squares. And a lot of, I guess, well or elegantly coiffed eco-professionals going about their business, and ads everywhere to do with COP26 and climate change. And so for people that are sitting at home watching a quiz show or whatever else it is, they're surrounded by ads about climate change and COP26. So all in all, a fairly normal, quiet November day here in Glasgow. And it unsurprisingly left me wondering, how much does COP26 really matter? What is it going to change? Who's even paying attention? I guess the brutal reality is that we know CO2 concentrations are still rising and lots of promises are being made, but what's actually being delivered? So to help me reflect and dig into all of this, I'm joined by Blair Palese, who is in Sydney, who hopefully will appear any second, and Paul Herman, who is, for the moment, still in San Francisco, although shortly moving to Chicago. And I thought we'd just start. Obviously, I think everyone who's tuned in today probably knows that many countries have got a net zero commitment by 2050. A few are for later years. One or two still have nothing at all. But one of the big items in all of this, Blair, is coal. And one of the first announcements we had, because last week was in a week of large announcements, one of the first announcements to come out was essentially an end of coal. What is that all about?
Yeah, it's certainly sending the signal that we need to speed that up very quickly, that we need to support developing countries to do the same. It's a really strong market signal effort, I think. Noticeably absent was Australia and China, which Australia being the largest exporter of coal. Not a good sign for Scott Morrison, but what a surprise.
But South Korea is a signatory to this, obviously, which has been a big importer of coal.
You cannot deny that our importers will be not buying a lot of coal in the longer term, certainly not in the short term a bit, but I think, you can pretend all you like by not signing on Australia, but your market is drying up quickly is definitely the message. I think
and also, so countries like exactly Poland, I was going to say, because Poland,
really important,
massive user of coal, etc.
Yeah,
so that's quite significant.
It is significant. And I think China, we could talk about China a little bit later. We just did a big story that they've been around the world briefing people on their 37-point plan on climate. I don't think you can pretend that they're not signing on to this means they're not acting and they don't take climate as a real driver for their future economy. So I think it does leave countries like Australia very much out in the cold on this by not being at the table, by not being party to where these talks are taking people in terms of the alternatives. But, it's symbolic in the sense of sending a signal, but it's important. And I wouldn't, there are lots of toing and froing about the outcomes of COP so far, many saying it's not enough. And sure, that's absolutely true. But I think, pacts like this and commitments like this are really important. And it does show investors in particular, like if you're not out of it yet, probably a good time to start looking at your exit strategy from certainly any new fossil fuels and coal in particular, but in particular, coal.
And there was a good piece in the FT today precisely about that, which to me illustrated part of the problem, which was a whole series of different investors saying, well, we need to be active about our investments and having different ways of doing that. And essentially most of them having been singularly ineffective in whatever they've done, there comes a point in time, in my view, where if the company isn't acting, either you need to get together with other shareholders and drive action, or you shouldn't have your money in there, because what we know what we need from the coal companies, and for that matter from the oil and gas companies, which is no more exploration and no more development. And if they're doing that, then that's a start. And this is, China, Japan, South Korea are already committed not to financing any new projects, so they're kind of signed up to that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, Australia can pretend all it likes, but the end is nigh.
Yeah, it's not a good place to put taxpayer dollars or shareholder dollars to be the last investor in the last coal mine to be built. This doesn't make you look like a star.
Yeah, and there's just to build on this a second, there's the cost of capital, at least for oil and gas. The coal wasn't quoted in this in Bloomberg today, but the cost of equity and the cost of debt is going up. So what is working is the bank pressure to not loan to these projects. And so that doesn't mean that they can't find private debt or private equity. And so there is a sort of a last gasp of private equity going after oil, gas, extractives, production, pipelines. And there's probably still, there's an active LNG, liquefied natural gas market. It has a much higher markup of $18 a cubic foot instead of $3, $4, $5 a cubic foot. So that the good news is the banks are putting the pressure on the cost of debt. That also drives up the cost of equity. That drives up the overall cost of capital. And now you have to start asking, what's the payback period on a 20% discount rate versus the payback period on a 3, 4, 5% discount rate? And the good news is more financing for renewables is driving cost of capital down into that low single digit area as well. And then in portfolios, fossil-free portfolios are outperforming non-fossil-free portfolios. On a quarterly basis, there's some pops of oil prices, but those come with volatility. And so on a risk-adjusted return basis, it's going to be a more resilient, stronger portfolio for a world that we all need to live in.
Yeah, and the other thing in here is, sorry, Blair, I was just going to observe, if for people that are directors of these businesses that are still investing in new projects, surely there comes a time when you're horribly exposed because you could have, should have, must have known that this was a bad idea. That must eventually become a real risk.
And on that, legal front / your point, Paul, about the banks, that didn't happen by accident. The activist groups have been putting pressure on globally for the last 8-10 years, and real credit to them for pointing out, really what normally had not been the fodder of NGOs, but looking at debt, risk, insurance, going after insurers for new fossils. That stuff's been really important to raise people's awareness about how this stuff gets propped up. So it's all well and good for countries to say we're out of coal. The mechanism by which it's being financed has to be targeted, and they've gone after that over the last 8 to 10 years. And some of the shareholder activist groups, you look at Engine Number 1 and Exxon, and you just have to see a dramatic change in the attitude about how to go after the kind of change that's needed. None of that stuff's really talked about at COP probably, but it's important, and it's happening all over the world.
And on that topic, not at COP, but during COP26 week, yesterday, a former commissioner of the SEC said publicly at the Sustainable Brands New Metrics Integrate Conference, which is this week, expect Scope 3 emissions guidance from the SEC reporting from the Biden administration. And
that's big stuff.
Some of you may know that I had a active debate with the former head of the SEC about greenhouse gas emissions, and he was not a believer. But so we'll see some, potential progress, at least on reporting. And Scope 3, if you don't know yet, Scope 1 is what a company can control inside its walls. Scope 2 is the energy that you buy. And then Scope 3 is sort of this wild west of supply chain, further up the chain, and customers. And so there was talk a few years back about making it scope 3 and scope 4 to make that more specific. So there's not a great technical standard to capture all of that. So the good news is, we'll have more information and data, but the challenge will be we won't know yet how to standardize that. But Blair, maybe you're seeing more on the life cycle analysis.
Yeah, well, on the company commitment side, lots moving to scope 3, which is really great to see. And at this point, it's the leaders, but it's impressive. And you look at Andrew Forrest, and Fortescue is looking at scope 3, BHP is looking at scope 3. Those are the hard industries to really make that work. So that's a big signal that everyone sees it coming, and that's good. I just want to mention, this week at COP, it's not over because the big world leaders have left, and it was nice that Obama showed up week 2 in some ways, just to tell people it was still going on. But, the financial mechanism piece of this conference is critical. It's not as sexy as big announcements, but Nigel, it'll be interesting to hear if you've heard on the ground, like we're writing some stories on the sterilization financial side, because it's a real missing piece. And how do we get out of coal, oil, and gas when a lot of this stuff is still financed and there's still money in play, and you can keep selling this stuff on and to bottom feeders for at the end of time, and that will not mean these projects come offline. So what are the ideas for how you sterilize projects, some of which are old and running out of steam and are going to not be productive anyway, but some that are maybe early or midstream and have years to go? What does that look like? Who are the brains of thinking through? And I've heard of 5 or 6 different financial strategies. It's an area to watch, and I'm just curious to see if COP does any kind of nods to ideas they think are going to work.
Look, and I know we've talked a lot over the last few months about the rise of ESG related investing, and significant amounts of money are flowing into those funds. Where that money ends up, of course, is in existing companies. Not much of it is going into new projects, and some of that is only lightly green tinged at best, I suspect. There has obviously been the Mark Carney initiative announced in the last few days, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, 43 banks, 23 countries, a large number of trillions of dollars involved. And it's businesses like Lloyds Bank and NatWest and Barclays and HSBC here in the UK, Santander in Europe, and et cetera. And of course, that kind of commitment is a great sounding commitment. And we all know for anything that looks like infrastructure style projects, there's plenty of money out there. But to your point, how does that nice commitment get translated into actual action and winding down the portfolios all those banks currently have? Because they're not, if they try to pull their money out, it's going to be incredibly hard to refinance the debt. And then that stuff will end up on their balance sheets as equity if they can't refinance it. I may have slightly oversimplified the capital rules there, but that's essentially how it will play out, which of course is a huge risk. So, again, another important initiative, but where it leads, I think, remains for the moment uncertain.
Yeah, I think I've heard HSBC is working on a particular sterilization approach project. And one thing to watch that's interesting are things like pumped hydro in old mines as a reinvestment option. So, there's sort of, and the blended finance side of cleanup being put together with some, private equity, but also community government and or impact investors interested in exploring some structure around what could answers to this be. It's a big problem. Let's face it, there are thousands and thousands of mines all over the world that need to be taken offline, power plants as well. It's going to be a tricky one, and let's hope the big brains of the outfit at COP this week are spending some time on that one.
Yeah, and look, that's probably a neat segue to methane. So another big announcement over the last few days has been a commitment really led by the EU and the US to reduce methane emissions by 30% by 2030. It's quite significant. It only really relates to, as I understand it, to really the oil and gas industry. And whilst methane emissions are pretty significant, we still shouldn't get distracted. This isn't the main prize. I don't know if you've got any views on this one, Blair.
I'll just for the accent, it's also called methane. So methane.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, look, the fact that they got there, they delivered that right up front is really important, because of the impact of methane compared to, other greenhouse gases. And look, the devil's in the delivery for this one. It's going to be a really hard one to deliver on. But I
don't think there's a lot of clarity as to exactly how it's going to be achieved. I mean, some of it presumably is properly plugging old leaky wells, and that's
Right.
important, particularly for anything that might end up being used for capture and storage of CO2. But we might come back to that later, because again, that's not really a big prize in the near term. What we need to do is stop the emissions, not try to put them back in the ground, because the carbon capture and storage is only economic for some quite narrow use cases.
Yeah, absolutely. But it does mean that this puts pressure back away from coal and oil, which has always gotten kind of a bit more of the limelight in terms of climate phase out push, and gas, the marketing effort of convincing people that gas is a transition fuel, which of course is bullshit, excuse the expression, but because of methane, it's so impactful that you just can't say, but we need it in the mix for an extra 150 years is going to equal, we will not keep below 2 degrees. So that's a nice idea if you're a gas company, but it doesn't mean anything if you're serious about addressing climate. So that phase out and the bringing of methane to the agenda at the real start of COP, I think was really sent a strong message and was really important. Of course, you have to look at who's not signing on. Australia, again, what a surprise. Basically went to COP and signed on to nothing. I just want to throw into, I guess, the upshot of all this stuff, of all these commitments, the Carney, the coal, the methane, et cetera. Being at the table means you are then pulling your foot out of the fossils and putting a strong foot into the opportunity side from an investment point of view, whether you're a country or private equity or you're whatever level you're in, innovation side, impact funds, et cetera. You cannot come away from this COP not feeling that it's getting pretty exciting on the investment side for innovation and opportunities. That methane piece really sends that message, because we're not sure how we're going to do it yet. So it sends that kind of open season, let's bring everything to the table, and how fast can we start investing in some stuff to see the alternatives coming to the fore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we'll come back to this, because there have been a couple of other recent developments which really focus your attention on the potential for there to be clear winners and losers, not just in an industrial sense, but in a national sense too. I just wanted to go back, though, to another area, which is ending deforestation by 2030, another pledge, this one signed by over 100 countries, I think 123 the last time I looked. Again, this is obviously a big thing, particularly for some nations. So Paul or Blair, you want to just comment on that a little?
Yeah, again, really important signal, not fast enough. Not exactly sure how they're going to deliver that. It was a sweeping statement versus a how-to. That's going to require big investment by the developed world to see that delivered in the countries that are still, really facing no idea how to stop it. I don't know. What do you think, Paul? I think somehow we're going to have to get to some really creative opportunities to try and encourage this kind of stuff to actually be delivered on.
Yeah, creative is an operative word. Action is an operative word. There's some major transformations that will need to happen here. And technology is probably the way it's going to happen until there's actual sea level rise, maybe in Washington, D.C. There's an actual wildfire in Canberra, or the Thames overflows and floods Parliament, because there is still not real action. The good news is, like, the infrastructure bill now is underway in the U.S. There's money for clean water and cleaner energy efficiency. There's, Claire's going to love this, $50 billion for climate adaptation of, something that is trillions, not billions. But it's at least a step in the right direction to get there. But Nigel has talked previously about fossil-free, emissions-free concrete, and applying higher heat to then curb emissions. The car companies, I think we're talking about in the pregame show here, they have committed to 2030 and 2040 goals by Volvo and Porsche and Ford. But the Obama administration in the US put in place a miles per gallon target. The Trump administration undid that. There hasn't been a resurgence yet of the MPG target. So the market forces are going to work faster than the government forces, but the government forces have to get in gear here. And so one of the things at COP that I think both in a previous COPs and in this week have been the island nations. So the island nations like Tuvalu and Palau and the Maldives off of India, which some of you may know from surfing. Those will not last this century if ocean rise takes effect. They're part of, and this was part of a ESGX a couple weeks ago about the Global South, what are either the capital transfer, reparations is probably the wrong word, but at some point those islands are going to become difficult or unlivable. And so this rich nation subsidizing poor nations for the transition is, this will facilitate migration. I mean, I think I'm generally a long-term optimist, short-term worrier, but the more we delay on action, it's going to take disasters to mobilize people. And just like it took wildfires in California, it's going to take some sea level rise. It's interesting. One more thing on this is when the big hurricane hit New York, most of the buildings were unprepared when that came around, except one corporate headquarters. And it was the Goldman Sachs headquarters. And they were sandbagged up and protected, the Goldman Sachs headquarters. So it's still going to be kind of a free-for-all. So what is important about COP26 is to continue to keep the pressure up. And so Nigel, you kicked it off by saying like, well, why be here? There's probably an electricity of being there, right? There's electricity of people wanting action and committing to action, a lot of individual contributors. So Nigel, what can you say about like individual contributors who aren't governments and what they're doing that you've seen in Glasgow?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we're going to come out of this and there will have been a whole series of announcements, and people, I think, generally are going to feel a little bit disappointed and disaffected, perhaps because there's no one big thing that's going to solve all of this. Actually, what's required is a whole set of measures across a whole series of industries by a whole set of people. There are clearly areas where, in countries where people will feel very disappointed with their politicians. There's plenty of progress not being made in the US thanks to the political environment there. The same is certainly true in the UK and in Australia. And if one thing that comes out of this is that people end up very cranky with some of those politicians and it gives them the fire in their belly to vote some of them out, then I think that in itself is a powerful thing. And what drives that, I don't know. It's hard to put your finger on it, but I think there's that from some of the people I've been talking to today who are very involved in all of this, a kind of mixed set of emotions between there being some really important initiatives being announced, but absolutely, as you're talking about, a lack of urgency. There's money being committed to things, but there aren't checks being written. There's new initiatives, but who is actually going to be doing what? Who is going to be held accountable? When are they actually going to deliver? Some of those details seem rather less visible. That being said, this could, of course, be part of what comes out of this at the end, which is some, clearer measures which bring it all together and give accountability and speed, although I don't think I will be holding my breath for that, to be honest.
I think that's
one thing I was going to come to, because Mark Johnson had asked a really good question here, just to turn the spotlight back on China for a moment. And obviously China is not here and as Mark has put it in the Q&A, that to some degree the position of the Chinese government is that their scientists will address these challenges, and it is not something for the day-to-day ordinary person to worry about. In some ways, and certainly from what I see through the eyes of those who are closely involved with China, that's not necessarily a particularly bad proposition, because China has been very far-sighted on a number of things. They've been pursuing the thorium cycle power development program for, 7, 8 years. That's I don't know where that's got to now, but they've done things like that. If they were really planning to keep on burning coal for the rest of time, you would think they might have bought and secured supply of coal around the rest of the world. And it's something that China as a nation has invested barely $1 in outside China. Literally, the amounts are tiny compared to what they've done in rare earths, where they went and bought up most of the rare earths some long time ago. So certainly part of this is that China has been focused on long-term thinking and driving some of the changes. It's also been focused on how do you balance financial interests and i.e. capitalism 1.0 with impacts on environment and impacts on people, capitalism 2.0. So I have quite mixed views about China, and that there's plenty of things that you could easily be concerned about judged from outside, but there's also a lot that China's been doing, which is, in some ways, it gives me hope, ironically, because the action is very purposeful. China started looking for these solutions in the 1980s.
Yeah, I actually think they don't think they even need to bother going to COP, because they'll just get on with their own agenda. They're curious, of course, to know what the world thinks and is doing, but I don't think it has. Everything we've read, the speeches we've been watching. So the Chinese before COP went around and did a series of briefings for businesses in particular and business partners, places like New York. There was a recent student discussion. The speeches were made available. They see climate as their driver for the Chinese century. There's no question in my mind about that. So that should give us a little hope for their speed of action. And no country in the world can move as quickly as China can by the nature of their government. India has put on its plan, which was quite, I think, a surprise and well received at COP. But it's still a chaotic country, so the guarantee of their being able to deliver on what they've said is harder. Modi is no mover on getting off of coal in the way that China is, and I don't know. I think China sees this opportunity of how to make the transition and the new innovation and technologies as critical to its role in the world. It'll spar with the US on this stuff, but I think before in the Trump days, China stepped up thinking this is our moment, and I think they'll keep going. So I think there's some hope in the speed that China looks to be. The 37-point plan that we've heard talked about is very specific on everything from financial mechanisms to encouraging, every kind of green transition within as well as without. Of course, we'll have to see if they deliver on it, but I think it bodes well for certainly saying that their being at COP is not a disaster. It's their way of saying, well, we're just going to get on with it. It's worth noting on this call, the great report by Global Witness as to who were the largest number of people, of course, at COP.
Yeah, I was going to ask you exactly about this, Blair. So, so I'm at COP and lots of other people are, but who actually is here?
Well, if you haven't seen the story, it's a good BBC version of it, but Global Witness got a hold of the 1,000-page list of who's attending and where they're from. Over 500 people from the fossil fuel sector. So if you think this is clean, or that we're finished with that last gasp of attempt to control every aspect of these negotiations, let's not kid ourselves. It's dangerous. They shouldn't be allowed in. They should have stopped this years ago. Here we are. The Australian tent, if you will, the country exhibition had Santos printed all over it. If that doesn't tell you how dire the situation, out of touch nature of Australia is, you got to wonder. But the other
exactly, there's a great seminar on vegan produce at 1 p.m. and an absolutely great party sponsored by the oil and gas industry for the after party. So
because
there is not a little
the onus
irony.
is all on us, right?
Yeah.
And how we're eating. The other weird thing about this list that we had to dive into yesterday at the Climate and Capital Media team, that there were the largest number of country reps there was Brazil. Like with Bolsonaro in place, that doesn't bode well. And then countries like Turkey, Canada having huge numbers of people there. So is it bad that China's not there? Maybe not. Maybe it's better they stay home and get started. And, you know, to some degree, you kind of have to think, really, is this COP setup fit for purpose anymore? My sense is it's time to scrap this whole World Expo idea and start with specific topics on mechanisms, and only the people having to do with sorting out what that looks like should turn up. If we need a World Climate Expo, let's not call it COP. Let's not put negotiations and treaties and the like on the agenda. Let's, you know.
Yeah, I agree, because it's all getting too, it's getting a bit too late for that, and things need to move much more quickly now. And that's perhaps a neat segue. We have a book coming out tomorrow called Visions 2030, and part of the point of this book was to try to bring to life the idea that actually there is hope and significant things can be achieved by 2030. It's available from the website visions100 in numerals.com. And I wrote a piece in it. You know, my take about this really was to say, you know, and this is viewing the world from 2030, it's hard to say when the carbon enlightenment took hold. And as things stand today, it doesn't really matter as long as you live in a nation that began to act purposefully by the early 2020s. For you, the outlook is bright. And for the laggards, environmental risk became economic pain all too quickly. And the point I was really trying to drive at, and I wrote this, you know, early this year before a few things had unfolded, but I was really trying to bring out this theme that it's not just winners and losers in terms of individual businesses, but there are countries that will be advantaged out of this or will lose. And where I wanted to go then was this idea of a steel and aluminium green trade zone between the US and the EU, i.e. the idea that there's going to be trade in a commodity that may live effectively outside World Trade Organization rules. And for anybody that's not participating, you know, things will look pretty unattractive. I don't know if you've had a chance to dig into that one yet, Blair.
No, I haven't. I'm intrigued by, you know, there's a lot of carrot and stick coming out of this COP, and then the financial that leads on from that. But like Kerry's got not a lot of attention played, but his two things. One is the announcement of the green trade commitment between the EU and US on steel and aluminium. So that, and the big question I have and haven't seen anybody answer yet is, will the WTO say, yeah, that's good, but we've got climate problems, so we're going to let that stuff stand? I've heard discreetly behind the scenes that they will, that they're not interested. They will get climate on board, and they will think differently about trying to stop anything that doesn't equalize trade to all nations. That, to me, would be maybe the biggest thing to come out of a COP, and we're not hearing a lot about that, but also Kerry's First Mover Coalition. So you're seeing the players ahead starting to look for their own economic opportunities, and, you know, investors and others will bode well by watching what that is and how it goes. Where is that sitting? Who are the players? What tech and what systems are they looking to prioritize? And then carbon border taxes is the kind of stick that's coming, as well as potentially sanctions for countries that aren't going to come to the party. Australia, for instance. It's time to start putting these things on the table and talking about what that's going to look like. It's not going to be all good. There'll be plenty of countries that don't want to come, and will have to get penalized somehow in order to bring them around. And for investors, it's watch that space to see who the leaders are, what that looks like, and can you get on with backing some of these tech innovations and companies that are really ahead. I mean, one thing worth noting, we just started, I did a profile of Danny Kennedy at New Energy Nexus. If you want to know where the great opportunities are coming, just watch Danny's outfit. And I think the 243 companies they're looking at, small startups, you know, this year that are moving so fast. He mentioned one in particular that's in my story, that started 4 years ago as nothing, a bunch of people with an idea on a battery alternative. They got investment from Boeing. They're now scaling up to the point where, warehouse size manufacturing. 4 years that took. So if you want to find out where those opportunities are, follow the likes of the unicorn supporters who are really know what to back, how to back it, and are not in the mainstream of finance kind of setups or big companies. As Danny said in the interview, I'll back the disruptors every time. They're the ones that are going to cut through, are not going to be slow to move, are going to move much more quickly, and are able to, be more agile in how they speed up, what they can bring to the market. So for investors, that's a fantastic opportunity if we know where to look.
Yeah, and look, I think that's a neat segue, because we could keep burying through some of the other things that happened, but the only other one thing I was going to mention, it was a small thing today, but the UK fashion industry, of course, clothing uses all sorts of things where the downstream impact isn't terribly good, and we don't use a significant proportion of the clothes we buy in the first place. But they've increased the commitment from reducing their emissions by 30% now to halve their emissions by 2030. This is mostly from the designer world, but you also have some really big names like Primark, I think, in there supporting that. So, I don't think we'll get into the detail of that now, but it's just interesting to see some of those other things happening, which of course in part is driven by consumers. And what I thought we should do just now is to talk a little bit about, okay, so all of these things are happening. There's some action by governments and some initiatives from the private sector. But, where are the big areas where what we're seeing is just not enough? And what should we be doing about it?
Yeah, well, financial mechanisms. Let's get how can we make this sexy for people? Like, a lot of people are just not even paying attention. If you haven't read,
I was going to say, this is Paul's special subject, so I can see a big smile on your face there, Paul.
Hey, Paul, did you read Ministry for the Future, Kim Stanley Robinson book?
I did not, but I should.
Well, if you want to know where it's all going and get excited. And he was actually at COP and gave a great talk. And he talks about the people really looking at creative approaches. And anyway, it's a good talk if you haven't had it. It's leaping ahead to what's possible. I'm sure you can think of a million ways we do this better and creatively, but it's time to really, take off the shackles and get creative about how we encourage people to take some more risks into speeding up innovation.
Yeah, I mean, the speed definitely needs to be, I think if we were to pick like one thing, it would be greenhouse gas accounting, pricing, markets and exchange, and a carbon tax, like that package.
Yeah.
And so every day we hear Dow is up, Dow Jones is up, or ASX is up, or the FTSE index is up or down. We don't hear what's our greenhouse gas exposure. Bloomberg this week is continuing its free version of Bloomberg Green. So if you want free access to anything going on at COP or environmentally, Bloomberg Green is doing that. They have a daily newsletter that you can read every day. The click-throughs don't always go through if you're not paying them. And the reason why that's becoming, I think, like the single metric, the greenhouse gas metric, is in the European Union taxonomy that's being developed, that could be commercialized it could be released as soon as 2022, but probably 2023. There's metrics like biodiversity impact, and we certainly need to stop our erosion and killing of species and species loss. But as I've had follow-up conversations with scientists and standard setters, nobody has a biodiversity metric. You can't go to a database and saying, how many species are you killing? And they all come back to, for now at least, until we have Google and Tesla satellites, measuring heartbeats of hummingbirds. They all come back to greenhouse gases because it's sort of a common, if least common denominator is the right word, but a common translation. So methane is anywhere from 14 to 21 times a greenhouse gas. When the ozone opened up over Australia a couple decades ago, and they shut down all the refrigerant production. That was one that had like 1,000 or 10,000 greenhouse gas equivalent. So it allows a translation of different emissions and the chemistry of them and the carbon impact of them. And it allows for a simple one metric that we already have a database of 20 years. The good news is CDP for the past 20 years has a track record of several hundred to several thousand companies over 20 years, and now almost 8,000 of them. Cities are reporting to CDP on their greenhouse gas emissions. They don't have control over all of them. Over the city buildings they do, but not of the 40% that is transportation or the other 40% that is housing and buildings related. So the carbon tax is something that the energy companies want because they don't want to foot the bill. So that is going to probably be the way that it goes. But because it will also start to shift behavior by buyers and consumers. But the carbon exchange, in the US, the Chicago Carbon Exchange fell apart after a couple of years, but the private Northeast US exchange has continued. And so that's allowed utilities and manufacturers and producers to advance. And then there've been some better advances in Europe and London and the financial markets there and the carbon exchanges. And then there's a whole field called the social cost of carbon. And so just like if you're next to a waste management plant or a coal power plant, there's air emissions that you can calculate from the pollution that then cause asthma and impact the health. And so the social cost of carbon, so carbon has floated anywhere from like $5 a ton of 2,000 pounds, US pounds, to 40 or 50. Some companies internally, like Microsoft, have used this $50 or so rate. Shell has used an $80 a ton rate. There are some companies that have used $200 a ton. But once you start factoring in the social cost, and I don't think the biodiversity has been baked in, you're into the hundreds of dollars per ton. And this is where prices start to shift 5%, 10%, 20% or more. So that whole ecosystem, I'd say, let's settle on greenhouse gases. It's not perfect, but it's a lot. Let's get the pricing going. Let's get the markets and exchanging going. It's going to be a necessary mechanism for net zero and ultimately absolute zero greenhouse gases. And then governments, just like tax rates, there can be harmonization of greenhouse gas prices, taxes, markets, incentives, just like there is now from the G20 about having a minimum 15% corporate tax rate. So there you go. Yeah. We can smile.
Yeah, and just also to add to that, this point about how do all these things connect together, there is new modeling coming fairly soon, which will start to address what are really the connections between CO2 in the atmosphere, biodiversity, how does it all fit together? That's a 2022 thing, which I've had some involvement with, and will be fascinating when it's done. There were some talks at TED, the pre-COP TED event, which will be made public, I think, towards the end of this month. They'll be put up online, and we'll share details of those when they're out. The one thing I was going to put in, and then I'm going to throw this question to Blair as well in terms of what's missing. For me, it is just end fossil fuel subsidies. As a microscopic example, Australia has a new plan to support the rollout of electric vehicles and will invest $250 million, as I understand it, over the period to 2030, whereas it spends something like $10 billion a year on fossil fuel subsidies. And of course, the figures at a world level are enormously larger. That's got to be one thing that just has to go. It doesn't make any sense at all that taxpayers are paying taxes and giving it to fossil fuel companies that are not paying when they should be paying a price themselves.
Yeah, it's insanity.
Blair, is there anything else big that's missing that you really, that kind of worries you because it's not there at a really big and hairy level?
Well, just two things that I heard sort of optimistically before and during the first week is developing countries looking to creative ways to fund resilience in response to climate impacts, in developing countries. So we will pay you to retire your fossil fuels early, and we'll do that by investing in helping you to be more resilient as climate impacts start to happen.
So there is a specific package of South Africa, right? It's like $5 billion to support that.
But bigger than that too. I gather there's more discussions about South America, the Pacific, et cetera. That's great. Watch China play the soft politic game of trying to muscle on into that, I'm sure, in every possible way. Heads up America, because, and Australia sitting right next to the Pacific, really paying no attention to this issue of, hey, you might want to geopolitically be involved in supporting these countries in a bigger way, putting a little...
We'll help you shift to renewable energy. And by the way, we've got all these great electric cars that are much cheaper than the European ones. Exactly. You could imagine they might all just arrive on a big ferry. Yeah.
And, for Australia not to recognize this might be a little bit of an issue since it's right out our back door, but not really happening. So I guess, at the risk of saying the same thing, the stick. It's time now to define what that's going to look like so that countries that are not in the right, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Russia, Australia, et cetera, begin to see what's coming in order to change on the economics, if nothing else. So that I haven't heard enough about what that's going to look like. And I was hoping there would be, let's have a session on sanctions. Eventually we're going to get to that. What's that going to look like? We can't solve this problem if 3 of the biggest fossil fuel producing countries say, we're just going to opt out of that and keep doing what we're doing. So what's that going to look like? And sure, we can all say the market can take care of these things, but in fact, we do have to bring countries along and bring about change. So I guess that is my one thing I'd say. We need more of that. We need more people who are the progressive companies and countries saying that we need to do that. And we need the WTO to be able to say, we're on board for climate. So we're going to be part of the solution side, not the bring your case here, Australia and Russia, if you have a gripe with something coming your way, telling you have to do more. That'd be my big thing. And then I guess, hey, no women at the table. Are you kidding me? The delegation picture was 98.9% men. That's just got to change. When you talk about stuff like fashion, being a driver, look to the economies where women are the drivers. And guess what? They're not being looked at in the COP sense because women aren't at the table. The same can be said for a lot of developing countries who have low budget.
And indigenous nations who have been poorly represented throughout this. Yeah.
And, but the solution side is interesting. And Danny's investment at New Energy Nexus tends to be largely in the developing world. Why? Because they're more innovative because they have to be, and they're also doing things for a whole lot less money. Andrew Forrest is not looking to the developing world because he's just a nice guy. If you're going to ramp up massive renewable energy to do things like green hydrogen, you're not going to put that in expensive countries. You're going to put that in African countries, the stands. You're going to put it in Indonesia. Indonesia is desperate to get out of coal, unlike Australia. It's looking for its way out of fossil fuel, capture. And if you can partner together, someone like an Andrew Forrest, who has his setup in Australia, just out the back door to go to Indonesia to set up massive renewables to make green hydrogen, that's a huge win-win for the world, for us, anyone who cares about climate. But it's also an economic opportunity to really ramp up speed. And for a country like Indonesia, they would just welcome that with open arms.
And there's another great question here, and which I think we should just look at. And then, actually, a very quick question. Danny's last name, Blair, is
Kennedy. Danny Kennedy.
Danny Kennedy. Yeah, so that's okay. It was a quick question from
story in the chat.
Fantastic. So, and there's another question here. An Uber activist like Greta Thunberg, or I might call her a surprisingly well-informed 18-year-old, makes a lot of headlines and garners media attention. Does she have a real impact that helps move the needle on climate? And if so, what is it? And I can say from a personal point of view, yes, because it's just another source of positive energy. Yeah, and she wrote the introduction in the wonderful Breaking Boundaries book, which is a film on Netflix with the wonderful David Attenborough in it. So the balance between youth and old people and the scientists in the middle for me is rather magical. But Blair, what do you think?
Absolutely. And also, I hate to say it, she gets such a reaction out of people. Like it kind of drives out the sort of pale, male, and stale. Oh my God, we can't stand to hear an 18-year-old young woman tell us what to do. Well, get used to it. Look, you know what? She's an incredible communicator. She's been so influential in so many important ways over the last, and she's spoken to young people's fear and frustration and galvanized that. That's all super important.
And show them that they can act, which is great. And I see this through some of the young people I see in my life, through kids and their friends. You know, there's a whole series of things where they are just already starting to act themselves in the way they live their lives. And those people are not going to grow up and turn into coal lovers. They're just not.
Yeah. So and I'll add on to that. It's not just Greta Thunberg, but also Alexandra Villaseñor and those associated with the Extinction Rebellion. If you haven't heard of the Extinction Rebellion, you should, because our young people are rebelling against extinction of humanity and extinction of species. So these are meaningful, global, highly active communications that some of us might be familiar with in the US, like after the school shootings, the Parkland shootings in Florida. You saw half a dozen to a dozen student leaders step up and continue to put pressure on. Now, the systems are so institutionalized, they seem like immovable objects, but they're going to start running for office. They've already, you could argue that they filled up the stadium that Trump was going to be at by buying all the tickets invisibly. They also have filed lawsuits in Australia and the US. Groups of young people have filed lawsuits that have gotten tossed out of court, even under Obama administration. Not by saying they're wrong, but they're saying, well, what can we do? Like the judge said to the young people, there's no resolution to this, so we can't issue a judgment. That is so ridiculous that it came to that. So it's mobilizing, educating, building coalitions, building these cross-border coalitions for, if not action now, action soon. And so I think it's highly valuable. And Greta, I think, gets a lot of credit because she was the one starting the school strike almost alone in the winter in Scandinavia, which then caught around and is active in Africa and Latin America. And so there's others who are active like her that aren't given as much airtime, but it's a global movement. And so this is the number one issue on most young people's agendas, bigger than even school debt. It's like, are we gonna have a planet to live on? Should I have kids? Some younger people are not having kids because of climate. So major leader.
Yeah,
fantastic.
Just one last thing. You alluded to it, Nigel, but this getting political. I mean, here in Australia, there's a real move for independents to come to challenge the two-party, system of people who are foremost, dedicated to their political party, not to their electorate. We see it with people like Zali Steggall and Helen Haynes, et cetera. Australian independents who've gotten in elected on a climate and integrity kind of platform. But we're seeing the same thing.
Zali Steggall is my MP, which is fantastic. And we had her on the show last week and she was just excellent. So sorry, keep
Boston
going.
just elected their first climate mayor. She's a young Asian woman, mom. I think you're going to see a lot more of that around the world, where people are just sick to death of the party politics getting in the way of people, politicians doing the job they're hired to do, which is lead on issues that are difficult, climate being one of them. And I think the onus is really on all of us. And even, if you're coming at it from an investor point of view, like you want to be part of the solution side, you can't be in a country like Australia and say anything but we are being utterly let down by a government who just will not lead on the issue of our time. And I mean that in a smart economic way. We're now getting dangerous to the point of excluding the opportunities that should be front and center for all Australians, whether it's jobs or investment or what our kids will do in 5 to 10 years. It's not going to be mining. So, I think this is a really important aspect of the COP by being, having said that, I think we're over the trade show factor of the giant COP. It does
But
certainly focus the world's attention, and it points to this political challenge that many countries are facing and the need to make it political, because that's the only way we're going to move through the blockers and the fossil fuel sector trying to prevent action.
And I think, Zali Steggall is a great example, because wherever you are in the world, the same message applies, which was she went up against the guy who had just been Prime Minister of Australia in a constituency where his party would typically win something like 70% of the vote. And she won 57-43 on a platform which was, I'm going to stand for everything that his party stands for, apart from climate change, where I want to see strong action on climate change. And if you can do it in that environment, then there's few more hostile constituencies than that. So it shows that it's possible. And Australia has an election coming up. It could be, in theory, it could still be before the end of this year, although that seems pretty unlikely. But sometime in the next 6 months, there will be an election. And just watch this space as to what happens in some of those marginal constituencies where more independent MPs are going to run. Now, I'm conscious we're heading towards the top of the hour here, so I thought we should just end with, what is one thing that everybody should be doing themselves, and indeed, what is one thing that they should be doing in their professional lives, not just in their personal lives. Maybe give that to you first, Paul, and then the same question for Blair.
Well, the one thing is live it every day. So what you buy, where you work, how you invest, how you vote. So the one thing is every day there's something for you to do. Eat less meat, put in that energy efficiency system, allocate to a fossil-free portfolio, get your company to have a fossil-free 401k. So there's something every day that all of us can do, buying, working, investing, banking, and voting.
Fantastic. So there you've got about 12 things from Paul. You should be doing all of them. You can do one a day for a fortnight and then start again. Blair, how about you? What's one thing you want to see people do in their personal lives and in their working lives?
I think it's, most people on this call are aware and active. So it's not only stepping up, but talking about it and talking about why you've chosen to step up and why it's so important to encourage others to do it. I mean, for companies, for investors, for people in their everyday lives, it's often not discussed as to this as an issue. People don't want to bring up politics. I think finding a way to talk about it, to say it's important that everybody understand it, get actively involved, and push for the change we need. That'll make all the difference. It'll make the difference when you go to vote. It makes a difference in your community and with your kids, whatever. All that's really important, but primarily also in your work environment. If you're working in a company that isn't moving, it's time to start asking them why, and say it's in your interest. It's not. This is no longer a step out and take a big risk issue now. It's a risk if you're not active. So getting people to understand that's really critically important.
Yeah, and I'd echo both of these. There are just little opportunities which come up every day to nudge people a little bit further down the path to, maybe this is the one day in the week that they don't eat any meat. But then that's one day in the week, and it's, maybe it's one meal out of 15 that week. That's quite a lot of percent in the right direction. So, and I've reflected a lot. We had Jane Goodall on the show a few weeks ago, and she talked about the idea that you can't grapple with all the world's problems. It's just too big and complicated and depressing, frankly. But you can find things in your own world that you can do something about, and you can act on them. And if you do, then you find other people that are doing it too. And simply talking about some of this stuff, whether it's at home or with your friends or at work, you then discover other people actually might be a little bit further along than you thought. And there's amazing power in that. So fantastic. Well, look, it's been a very, very helpful discussion. As always, I've learned a few very useful things along the way, as I suspect a few of our audience have too. For anybody that's watching on YouTube, please do use the like button. This does help get the message out to more people. Please do share this with your friends and colleagues. Please invite them to join future events. Details of all those are at esgx.org. And next week, Paul, what have we got coming up next week, apart from what on earth happened at COP, which we may not address because we may not have a result by this time next week.
Come back next week. We'll talk about COP26, but we'll talk about going climate positive with David Jaber, new author, new book. And he's bringing together a panel about food and agriculture and eating. And I'll boil it down to one thing: host a vegetarian or vegan dinner. And then you can do what Blair says, is talk to multiple people, go meatless, like Nigel said. And I have recipes, so write me for recipes.
and just to add to that, so the new mayor of New York, who's incoming mayor of New York, is vegan. He has a plant-forward agenda, has an ambition to reduce the amount of meat consumed in New York City by 2030. So watch this space. We will be returning to the subject of food and the great cities of this world in a future episode too. So the exciting times.
Thanks, everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much.